and they need to see us as well. Thank you everyone for joining us. We are delighted tonight to be welcoming you to this panel on talking about race in France. We have a very large panel in front of us, in front of me, and only 45 minutes to hear everything they have to say, so I'll keep this very brief. Just let you know that this event is organized in partnership with the Overseas Press Club, and we will be organizing another event with them in December and hopefully more in the spring, so we are so delighted about this partnership. Our wonderful, brilliant panel tonight is very large. On my left, we have Roger Cohen, who is bureau chief of the New York Times. Here we have Rokhaya Diallo, who is a journalist, filmmaker, activist, author, and much more. Vivienne Walt will be moderating this panel. She's governor of the Overseas Press Club and Paris correspondent for Time magazine. Then we have Mame-Fatou Niang, who is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And finally, we have Angelique Chrisafis, who is the Guardian's Paris correspondent. It is a very impressive bunch. We are delighted to have them. Please, can we welcome them with a round of applause?
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you also for the Overseas Press Club that's had this. I think it's like our 6th year we've been doing events here at the library. It's very hard, I'm sure you've all experienced, to talk about race in France. It's a very prickly subject in this country, and it's that prickliness, in a way, is rooted in a very, very strong commitment to effectively colorblind policies, not seeing race and or even much discussing race. And there are reasons for that, which we'll hear. But the big question, I think, in the light of what happened in June and July with the protests after the police killing of Nahel, I'm sure I don't need to give you all the background, but the big question going forward is how sustainable these policies are and how we kind of fit these revolutionary era ideals, wonderful ideals, into a 21st century context. The protests in June and July really felt to many people in France like a kind of George Floyd moment. And yet here we are, 2-3 months on, and we're back to talking about whether people can wear abayas at school, and there's a class action suit about racial profiling in stop and search, by police officers. So it's very fraught, I would say, and I want to start off just by asking Rokhaya, who's just come from the courthouse, thank you for making it here in time, where she is defending a lawsuit against her, defamation lawsuit, by the philosopher Raphael Enthoven, who has effectively accused her of trying to inculcate France with these American ideas of race and racial politics by trying to stop him from, in her mind, kind of harassing him, effectively trolling her for over a long period of time. Rokhaya, what has this experience been like, and what is it like to be a black French activist attempting to talk about race in this country?
Thank you for... Thank you. I guess you hear me more now. I'm glad to be here because I didn't know when the hearing would end. So as you said, I'm an activist, but I'm a journalist and a filmmaker, and I write on race. I happen to write for the Washington Post and the Guardian, which are English-speaking outlets. So that doesn't really help my case, being accused of importing ideas from the outside. So I was today the defendant in a trial started by the philosopher Raphael Enthoven, because the thing is that he started to mention me very often on social media years ago. harassing me because he was saying that we didn't agree. And at some point, the mentions were so intense that I requested several times. I requested him to stop several times, and he didn't. And at some point, I blocked him. But it was really intense. Like, I could have over 100 mentions in 10 days. So that was a lot. Yeah, I commissioned a study on his attitude on social media, and I think it was 467 mentions in a few years. So I was the topic that he discussed the most on those years. And so saying that, I blocked him, and I said, and I didn't speak about him anymore. And once someone bring him in the conversation on Twitter, and I said, why would you bring a harasser on social media? And he sued me for that. So that's why I had to defend my case today. So he forced me to meet him, actually, because I've never, a show asked me to be part of it this year. It was part of the show. I declined. Like, he has attempted several times to meet me. I didn't want to. And today I had to explain myself on calling him a harasser. And his lawyer, to describe me, said that I was that I had strong ties with the U.S. and whereas his client was defending the French identity. So there was that clear opposition between the two of us. That was interesting, and so it lasted 3 hours. The public prosecutor requested the court to sentence me. So we don't know what will happen. We will have the verdict on November the 7th. But to me, it's part of the attempt to intimidate people of color when they try to address race publicly, because it's not my first trial, it's my 5th. I have been sentenced once last year. I'm appealing, so I may be released, but I'm not sure. And to me, it's part of the process of trying to make you uncomfortable speaking publicly, and to make you question yourself whenever you want to bring a topic publicly. Because there is the topic of race that is very taboo in France. We have this idea that we are colorblind, and of course we're not. What has happened to Nahel and the figures that shows that if you are a young male perceived as black or Arab, you are 20 times more likely to be checked by the police than if you're not, means that we pretend to be colorblind, but the institutions are not colorblind, and actually your color can kill you. And the debate that we have on abaya, which is supposedly on laicity, is in reality on the visibility of Muslim. Do you have the right to be visibly Muslim and to attend a public facility? And that's the question for me.
Roger, I just want to turn to something that you wrote actually in your book, which just came out, which really struck me, and so I'm going to quote it. You said, the greatest strength of America, its core advantage over the old world, is its lack of interest in where you're from and its consuming interest in what you can do. So this clearly seems to be the case with France. And certainly talking to people of color in France, they say the first thing people see is your color, despite the colorblind policies. So what's the implications for France, and actually how do people respond when you say things like that?
Thank you, Vivienne. It's unusual to be on a panel of 4 women and 1 man in France.
That's the subject of a whole other panel.
Oh, this is an embassy? Yeah, I think as a general rule, the United States is certainly a more open society than France and probably any European society. It's it's a can-do, forward-looking country with enormous problems right now, which I will refrain from going into. It's always struck me here in France that there's this phrase, français de souche, which is really untranslatable, because certainly for an American, français de souche, as opposed to what? As opposed to other French people who are not de souche, who are not somehow rooted in the country with ancestry going back hundreds of years and white. But that is a distinction you hear all the time. And I was at the funeral of Nahel, which was a very moving, very fraught occasion near where the incident happened. And I didn't speak to a single Maghrébin Muslim living in France, many of them French citizens, who did not say that we are not entirely French. We are discriminated against, whether in the job market, driving around, in all sorts of ways. So I think everybody knows that behind laïcité, behind this notion of a colorblind France where you are educated into Frenchness and everybody is indistinguishably French after they have gone through this process. And that is the great strength of France, this universalism. I'm not saying that the model has not worked for people over the years, for immigrants over the years. And certainly there are Arabs living in France who are pretty pleased to be released from the overbearing role of Islam in the countries that they have come from. And there are Muslims and blacks, African blacks, who have integrated well into French society. But there are deep problems, and the problems are exacerbated by not having the analytical means to understand the situation. Where are the figures on intermarriage? Where are the figures on forms of prejudice? Where are the means to analyze the racism that evidently does exist in French society? And I think it's frustrating to live in a country which is denying, on many levels, a core problem. And this is creating dismay around the world. Just in the last 2-3 weeks, Vivienne, right? We've had the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. We've had Gutierrez at the UN. We've had the United Nations saying, we don't really think it's the role of a democratic government in a country like France to tell Muslim women or Muslim athletes how to dress. And this is affecting France's image in the world in quite profound ways. But I don't think the country's going to change. I think this is a fixed and immovable core of French identity. And I don't see it shifting, certainly not in the near future.
It is kind of amazing as a journalist when you go out and talk to people, the details that emerge. And I remember interviewing largely the filmmaker who made the movie Les Miserables a few years ago, about the making of the movie, in which he could not get any funding whatsoever, was told point blank there'd be absolutely no interest in a movie about life in the banlieue, and there would be no cinema distribution. Of course, it went on to be nominated for the Oscar and very nearly won it. I think it was beaten out by Barack Obama's, no, it was beaten out by something, I'm not sure what, but anyway, very nearly won the Oscar. So, Mum, I just want to turn to, can you give us like a quick history lesson? You've written a book called Universalism. This is your field of study. How did we begin here and how did we get here to where we are?
To answer that question, I would want to piggyback on what you said about you don't see France changing. The reality is that the country has changed. The country will continue changing. The issue is that it's not acknowledging the change. When we speak of the model of universalism, I often tell my students the way we speak of things oftentimes, locks how we see these things. I don't speak of universalism as a model. I speak of it and I wrote of it as a project. From the beginning, it was a project, right? It's like getting on a bus, you're 10 and it's exciting, we'll get on the bus and we're going to Disneyland, right? And we're riding from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we're going to Disneyland in California. Then the bus stops in Utah in the middle of the desert and say, we're there. No, we're not. We're going to Disneyland, right? So some people got discharged in Utah in the middle of the desert, no food, no water, and the rest are on their way to Disneyland. This is where we are, right? Where's the terminal? It's a project. So when we I just landed at 11:30 from DC and went straight to court because it was important to be there and see yet another example of this dystopia where we are where we're being forced.
You
right?
mean in Rokhaya's trial?
Rokhaya's court. What the reality is, what's the history that brought us into this reality, and what we are told we are seeing against all our senses, what we're smelling, what we're tasting, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, and we're told you're not seeing this reality. So universalism, right, has this pre-revolutionary idea, but the core of what we're seeing, right, what Rokhaya was just accused of trying to, like, literally the word was démanteler, dismantle, by riding this wave of, like the American Trojan horse that is destroying the republic. It's this, you have the root of the one. It's one voice, one project, one people, and building this respublica, the common thing, right, that works thanks to demos kratos, the power of the people. And it's amazing. But when those ideals that will build our republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité, laïcité, almost made it, were created, mounted, right, cemented in 1789, well, slaves are still slaves. And we have those very interesting, in our history, 5 years of fighting in the assembly. Well, if everyone is free, if we're really living thanks to these ideals, how can we have slaves? And we have these, just go back to that period of history when we hear, right, the better perish our economy than our principles. It will take 5 years for those principles to happen, and that the economy, that slavery is abolished, 1794. Well, guess what happened? Slavery is abolished, the economy tanks. You think of, Jean Tullard, a very famous French historian who was quoted on live TV 2 years ago, saying that, Napoleon had to make a pragmatic decision. The country is dying, and it's so funny. He uses like such a biological, medical. There's more than 10 words that are medical dictionary of a body that is dying, agonizing, and that needs to be resuscitated. He uses fresh blood, that need fresh blood, right? So, and then he says, yeah, slavery is reinstated, 1802, but nobody really complained. And to me, that nobody, like, how can you be free for 8 years and hear that someone is getting on a boat to come back and put you, your wife, your children back in shackle, and you don't care? And I'm not even talking about the white people who are in France, les amis des esclaves, who are not les amis des abolitionnistes, who are against slavery. So to me, that person, that nobody, that Jean Tullard states on live TV, explains where we are right now. The way we weave the history, the way we weave values, a project, without forgetting that when this was created, it was a project. Because guess what? Poor people couldn't vote. Because guess what? Women could not vote before 1944. And it took people, allies, I don't call it allies, I say active accomplice, because it was not just the people who were concerned, to fight and say, listen, we have a crack. I often give my students this metaphor. I have a very solid car. And one day, we lived in Louisiana. My son is here. He was 9 months. We locked him in the car. Panic. I tried to break the glass with rocks. Impossible to break. I could not believe it. It was impossible to break. Well, guess what? Then we moved to, I was at Brown. We moved to Providence. I had a small peck on that window. One day I'm driving and the window broke. And it was literally a tiny, tiny, tiny rock on the interstate that went on that window, created this little star. I didn't think too much of it because 3 years ago I tried to break it with a rock, it didn't break. So this tiny, tiny break in the structure can break and make the entire structure disappear. And it's by taking into account, right, the places where this superstructure is weak that you make sure that the structure survives. And when we go and say, my family has been French without discontinuity since 1835, and I'm called the 7th generation French, and everywhere I go, I'm asked, where are you from? There's something that shows that I'm not French. When you're 8 years old and you're the only one in your class who has the an ID because your mom is afraid. I'm not talking about a school ID. I'm talking about a French ID that shows your Frenchness. There is somewhere where the project is not complete. And when me and Rokhaya, and I'm going to finish there, go and show, we are showing, putting a light on where the project is not complete. We're not trying to disturb it, because I have my thing to say also about the US.
Angelique, I just want to get back to some of what you wrote about traveling around during the protests. And one thing that really struck me is you speak to somebody in one of the banlieues somewhere, not in Paris, and they say to you, people have no hope of ever escaping being stigmatized for where they live and their skin color. And of course, the most upsetting word of that entire sentence is ever. Can you just, from your reporting, what do you think is ever going to change to make that happen?
Yes, the person who told me that was somebody who'd been on the original marches in the 1980s for racial equality, and that were also inspired by this... which were also inspired by the relationship with police at the time. And this was in a banlieue suburb of Metz, near the German border, where there was some of the worst destruction of state infrastructure, actually. There was a library, a beautiful library in a very, very poor community, which was completely burnt to the ground, over 100,000 books and 12 million euros worth of damage. And that person I quote is one of the people in tears who had been working in the community. And what she was talking about herself, and what lots of teachers were talking about at the time, was that if you are a teenager or even 10 or 11 years old, particularly if you're a boy who is of black or North African appearance, you can be stopped and asked for your ID papers several times a day for simply standing outside or walking outside. And many people in those communities believe that alongside this idea of France having a very unequal education system, which was seen by the OECD, where you are very unlikely to be able to, you're less likely to be able to escape your social origins through the education system. So time and time again, traveling around the areas where there was unrest, teachers and teenagers were saying that they were being funneled into professional courses at the age of 14 instead of routes that would take them to university, and they were being stopped and asked for ID papers outside if they were perceived to be of black or North African origin, whereas their white friends might not be. And we've now seen the first time a court action has been brought through in front of the Conseil d'État last week, simply to say that the state is guilty of gross negligence, which we've heard from the United Nations, we've heard from the Council of Europe, we've even heard from Emmanuel Macron himself in 2020, who said in an interview in Brut, this is intolerable. And what the 6 organisations who are bringing this action, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, are saying is that the state is not doing enough. And when I spoke to Issa Koulibaly, who runs an association in Belleville, who's one of the organisations involved in this action, he said when he started campaigning on this action to do with stop and search or identity checks 10 years ago, he said he's a black activist, and he said, do you know what, I thought this is interesting, this is going to be relatively easy to fix because it's straightforward discrimination by les agents de l'État, agents of the state. It's against the rules, so we can simply make the rules fair. And now, with hindsight, he said to me, do you know, I feel that nothing has changed, and this is what the state action is being brought, not to give financial compensation to individuals, not on individual cases, which we've already seen the Court of Appeal rule on in France, of men or teenage boys who've been stopped. This is actually to say, no, we would like the state to be forced to amend the law. The rules for stopping and asking for an ID in France are extremely broad, and that's why you get more people stopped in France, although obviously this happens in the UK as well, but more people are stopped in France because you don't need to give an explanation. So boys aged 10 or 11 are being stopped without an explanation, and it will take at least a month for us to hear back from the Conseil d'État, but this is one of the areas where people believe if we can at least, it's not just about changing the law, it's actually about respecting the law to start with.
Roger, I think you wanted to respond to something Mum said, and also at the same time I'm just wondering, What do you think has been the kind of impact of Nahel, and what can come out of it?
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was just thinking, of course, on racial profiling and prejudice and police stops, America has, the US has no lessons to give France. And France has no lessons to give the US. And one of the interesting things about, your chances when you're stopped being black in the US by cops, as compared to your chances if you're white, they are radically, radically different experiences that have really little or nothing to do with each other. So one of the fascinating aspects of these transatlantic debates on laïcité, on wokisme, and by the way, the French coined that word. There is no noun in American, in English. There is that you can be woke, but there's no wokeism. Now France has coined a noun to express a whole movement. As if there's a movement of wokeism. The word doesn't exist in the US. So there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding, across the Atlantic. I was struck by your image of a bus, and this bus that is heading somewhere. I assume you're using Disneyland in a hopeful sense, although to me it's the ultimate horror.
No,
so
again, universalism is great because the project is great. I know.
Yeah, but I take it to mean that we're heading somewhere good. I feel, if anything, the opposite. I feel the bus in France is stuck. And, maybe sinking deeper and deeper into that, because when I lived here in the 90s, nobody talked about laïcité. It was just an aspect, if I'll quickly finish, it was just an important aspect of the Republic, but it was broadly accepted. If anything, laïcité was something embraced by the left, or embraced by the center left. It was an important part of France breaking away from religion and becoming the secular republic that it is. Now, laïcité is, front page of magazines, front page of the paper, and it's become the cause of the right. It has become the cause of the right and of the far right. The defense of laïcité and some of the left, yeah. But it's front and center. And so laïcité is the means that France defends its universalism, its republic, against these attempts to destroy the republic. And the attempts may be Islamic terrorism, from Islamist terrorism, from which France has suffered in an appalling way over the last decade. But increasingly, it is the United States. It is this plot by the United States through wokeism to destroy the republic, to replace universalism with identity politics. And what does wokeism mean? Well, it can mean, anything from gender politics to cancel culture to people who prefer tofu to barbecue. It's this crazy kind of term that, Ciotti says, he said the other day, and he leads the Republican Party, which is not even extreme right, it's center right, at least in theory. He said, wokeism is the new terror, the new terrorism that is intent on destroying the French Republic. So I wish I thought the bus were headed somewhere good, but I see the French digging in on laïcité.
Okay.
Yes, there are several things I wanted to comment. First of all, you mentioned the fact that many of the international outlets commented Nahel's murder as a George Floyd moment, and to me, that shows how people don't know that we have our own history of police brutality. Angelique just mentioned a march that started on October 15, 1983, which was the March for Equality and Against Racism, which was the first national march against racism in France. It was inspired by the March on Washington, which happened 20 years before. But so it started in Marseille and ended in Paris. And by the time they arrived in Paris, after a month and a half, there were 100,000 people. So it was more in proportion than for the March for Equality. But when we were celebrating the 30th anniversary of the March 10 years ago, only 19% of the French knew what was the march. If you ask to a French person who is Martin Luther King, they know who he is. If you ask them who is Tumi Jaija, who initiated the march, they don't know him. So amnesia is also part of the racial process and part of the erasure of the history of racism. And that also allows France to say that racism is not a French story. Because if you go to France, to Paris, you will find a park named after Martin Luther King. You will find a train station named after Rosa Parks. You will find some places named after Nelson Mandela. You won't find any place named after Tumi Jaija. This summer, the Minister of Education issued a video to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. I'm not sure of what will happen to celebrate Tumi Jaija, who is still alive, who lives in the suburbs of Lyon. So there is also this idea that we have nothing to do with race, and whenever something happens, it's almost automatically erased, because there was Nahel, but 18 years before, there was also Ziad Bena and Bouna Traoré, who was chased by the police and died in a power station in Clichy-sous-Bois for no reason. They were 15 and 17, and it's something that happens routinely every couple of years. So that's the idea that it was something related, like that it was echoing George Floyd's murders, instead of echoing something that was already in the French history. That's also part of the narrative that France is perpetuating on itself. We are very good at marketing the idea that we have nothing to do with race, but it's not the case. And the Cour de Cassation already sentenced France in 2016 for gross negligence for racial profiling. And I'd say that if laïcité, I think that if the idea of laïcité is so visible today, so laïcité in theory is the separation between the state and the religion, and the neutrality of the state and of the civil servants. But as a person, you don't have to be neutral. If you use a public service, you're not supposed to be neutral. The only exception is school. And that exception was voted in 2004. So that's not the application of the principle of laïcité, but that's an exception. And it's very important to underline the fact that the initial law of 1905 wouldn't allow any institution to request neutrality from someone using a public service, because the public service is supposed to serve the people, not to make them neutral. And I'd say that if we speak so much about laïcité today, it's because there have never been so many Muslims and people of color visible in the public sphere. The first case of public discussion about laïcité in 1989 was because of some girls going to school. It has never been a problem to have nannies, to have housekeepers wearing a hijab. It's a problem when you have someone going to school, when you have someone running for an election, someone on TV, on The Voice, someone who would be an athlete representing France. So it's not the problem is not the hijab itself, is how you associate your Frenchness with the hijab in a very visible position. And to me, that's the idea that to be French, you have to assimilate to a certain idea of Frenchness.
I just want to get back to you, Angelique, as the British journalist among us. So, we've spoken a lot about the US-France divide on this issue, which I think is obvious, but the UK, right, maybe not so obvious, but the UK also, you walk through London, there are plenty of women with hijabs on, you see them on television, you see them everywhere. There is a really different kind of way of dealing with diversity.
Yeah, handing over to Mame-Fatou in a few seconds, who's got a lot to say on this, but I think the UK has a completely different model, which would get into the word which I find very difficult to translate, which is communautarism, because when we try and translate that for a UK readership, it can seem very strange, this idea of what does that mean about pitching community against community. But also, again, in the UK, in terms of policing, we've also got no lessons to teach. It's been 25 years since the Metropolitan Police It's been 25 years since the Metropolitan Police have had to look at the idea of institutional racism, which is what, of course, we're talking about systemic racism as a conversation in the police here in France as well. And so we've seen Gérald Darmanin say in the summer there is no such thing as a systemic problem in the police. And we also have a report in the Metropolitan Police this year with similarly the Home Office saying no, it's not an institutional issue. So I think there are differences, but there are also similarities.
Mum, you wrote about how there's like a void in the vocabulary, a void in the rhetoric. We don't talk about race when us Americans try to raise these issues among French friends and so on. We get often a very annoyed response, particularly as Roger so correctly says, the US hardly has any lessons to teach France on the question of racism. So how do you break through what you call this void in rhetoric? How do you begin to talk about these issues in a way that can be honest and open and move this forward?
So to me, and again, I apologize because I realize that some people have nightmares because of Walt Disney and Disney World. So,
I'm not going to sleep tonight. So.
So to me, it goes back again to this idea of reality versus what you say is reality, right? To me, the void is here because someone say, oh, there is a hole here, don't step on it. And I will design everything that will help you go around it. But guess what? We've been going through it, and actually it's not a hole. It's here, it's land, and we've been walking on it. And I can tell you that this exists because I've been walking on it. It goes back to what Rokhaya was saying about this idea of anchoring. This is part of French history, right? We can go beyond 1990s. We can go beyond Kay. What made Algerians different? It was their Muslimness. So le statut des indigènes absolutely makes Islam and religion a reason to be officially half French. Right, you go back. What is the first police force created for in the 18th centuries? The black police, to make sure that because the land of France was sacred and only free men could be here, to make sure that any black people that you see would be asked for their papers. Check Abigail's history. So there is a story that links, right, this control of black bodies, this control of colonized bodies, to the control of bodies who are seen as non-French. And it doesn't matter if they've been French for 7th generation. There's something. But the thing, what Rokhaya says, there is a way to always keep this as a known phenomenon. It's not new. Like Macron's first reaction upon hearing of Nahel's death was, we don't understand what happened. How is it possible? So this is new, and the only way we can understand this newness is if it's being mediated through ways that we don't know, and one of these ways is the penetration of American ideas. So we have to keep doing what we've been doing, which is to say, this is our lived experience. This hole is not here because you say it's a hole. There is a way, and we've been living this. And just to finish on the one way we're mediating this, and it ties to what the conversation that we're having about the U.S. So in my department, I'm the first black scholar, black professor in the 200 years of my department. I'm French. In the 15 years I've been there, we've hired 8 other black professors. Only one is African American. When I was a grad student, I received a scholarship that was dedicated to help African American students enter grad school. I was the 11th non-African American to receive it. The first time I entered the Musée d'Orsay for a major exhibit, Le Modèle Noir, you hear it, it was thanks to a friend from Colombia. Anytime I attend really major things here, right, like the Louvre, it's thanks to American friends, especially African American friends. I have access to resources in Brazil that my black Brazilian friends don't have access to, but they can do that in the Netherlands. I was stopped by the police on campus at Carnegie Mellon. I've discussed this during a talk at the Metropolitan Museum, and with his guns drawn. When I moved to the US, I used to speak like this, and I took action reduction classes. And when he put his gun on me, the Frenchness came back, and my accent came, pooh. He put his gun down and said, is this a French accent? So in 1 minute, I went from being a black person driving a nice car on a campus with 0.3% blacks at 1 a.m. to being a French person. And at that moment, my nationality superseded my blackness. And that has been the experience of African American in Paris. Except when Baldwin said, when I was in that court and people are laughing at me and looking at me and pointing at my beady eyes and saying, look at this, I realized that those laughs, I've known these laughs. I've thought I left them in Mississippi and in New York. I know these pointed fingers, and they follow me here in Paris. And he writes this in the Sheet episode. At that moment, I became Baldwin. So there's something in this transnationality of anti-blackness that to me is the solution to the bus that is stuck. Because the French bus left us in Utah in the middle of the desert. Well, guess what? The American bus has dropped its blacks and is hailing at us. So we will get on that bus. And the British bus will get out. I mean, to me, this is, and we see it in the networks of solidarity and the networks that we're developing. I created a center that is not called a Center for Black French Studies. It's called a Center for Black European Studies. Because to me, it's the only way out of this insanity that our national countries, our countries are keeping us by the development, this echoing of this national narrative that is not taking anywhere. I don't have time. Rokhaya doesn't have any more time to assert her humanity. She is a person. She is whatever she wants. And for us to lose time having to defend our humanity, having to defend however we want to hyphenate our Frenchness with, is the waste of time in French of our nation. So to me, and I think that's what helps us going, that what's also, I mean, I have children and I want a good future for them, and to me, that's where I find hope.
I think we're going to throw this open to questions from the audience. I have one question, but I'm going to hold it back and see if there's a whole lot of hands shooting up. If not, I'll ask it.
I'll bring this microphone around, and we'll be opening this Q&A session up to our Zoom audience as well. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to send your questions into the chat, but we'll start in the room. Raise your hand very high, and I will bring this microphone to you. Yes.
Thank you very much for your contribution to the subject. I personally just finished a PhD on not on a similar topic, but on identity and ethnic identity. And I don't want to play devil's advocate because I suffered a lot at the Sorbonne, and it was really hard to convince them about the fact that these identities exist. However, I have a problem with the word race because in French and as well as in German, I'm from Germany, it is a very problematic word, and it might backfire in the French context. I want to give you an example with the black population in France. So unlike in the US, where many people are the descendants of slaves mixed ethnically from all different parts of Africa, most black people in France know where they come from. So if you just call them black, I might see a problem. Or for example, I'm half Iranian. If I'm thrown into all the Arabs, for example, and they themselves are all very different, this creates an animosity, and it creates new identities that are not there until now. If you're Moroccan, you're Moroccan. You're Moroccan French with a Moroccan heritage, with Moroccan Arabic. So I think if we would talk about ethnic identities, this might be more helpful in the French context, because they're ethnic identities that are very different, and the color of the skin is an outside view and not an inside view.
I think we got a response from Rokhaya.
Thank you so much for your question, and I guess how you've been struggling to make people believe in what you're working on. I understand it's very controversial to use the word race in France, but at the same time, it's a word that is in the Constitution. So it's not something that just came out in the 20th century. And there was actually, 5 years ago, a vote by the National Assembly to erase the word race from the Constitution. So it was unanimously voted by the National Assembly, but not approved by the Senate. So it's still in the Constitution. But that's interesting because it was in the Constitution as sans distinction de race, so without distinction of race, so it was meant not to discriminate against. And the idea that removing the word would remove racism is something very new, because at that time it wasn't seen in that way. So in French, usually what we do is that we use la race au singulier as a tool for racism, and not les races as having with the idea of several races, because we all belong to the human race, but la race is a process that oppresses and that makes that produces hierarchies. So that's the difference. And that said, that we tend to think that most of the people from France are from African parents, but many of them are from enslaved descent. Like France is the only country to be present on 4 continents, so we haven't spoken about that. But France in itself is built out of colonization, because we have, of course, the place where we are today with the French mainland in Europe, but we have places, departments in the Caribbean island, La Guadeloupe, La Martinique, the Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean, Mayotte, who is like just facing a major environmental crisis right now. You have the La Nouvelle-Calédonie, people are struggling to be independent from France and are still, under the French, depending on France. La Polynésie in the Pacific Ocean. So France is all over the place, and many of the people who are French and French citizens were ancestors who were enslaved. So it's something that is ignored in France, but it's something very important in our identity. Actually, the idea that we are importing things from America can be challenged with the fact that we are in America. The only territory that is under European control in Southern America is the French Guiana. All of them have been independent from Europe.
Just one thing, there were 3 times more, during the duration of the Atlantic slave trade, there were 3 times more African sent to the French sugar islands than to the United States. 3 times more. 3 times more.
I just wanted to quickly say, I think your point is very interesting. I mean, clearly, les lois raciales in France means something very specific. It means Vichy. It means a very unhappy period in French history, which France did its best to forget after World War II. And of course, with Nazi Germany, it's the same issue. And of course, the fact that France deported 70,000 Jews to extermination camps during World War II gives the lie, if a lie is needed, to this notion of universal liberty, fraternity, equality, etc. I mean, from the beginning, I mean, there just are problems. I think, in my own experience, people don't like to speak about their identity in France. I mean, if I'm in a conversation somewhere and I say I'm a Jew, I'm a Lithuanian, I'm a South African Jew, descended from a Lithuanian family, and somehow it's relevant to whatever we're talking about, you can feel a sort of little shiver of discomfort in the conversation, as if you're not supposed to allude to that. And when Zemmour appeared on the scene and started praising Vichy, somehow in all the coverage, it wasn't mentioned the fact that he's Jewish, he's a Jew, and here he is praising Vichy. But that somehow, I mean, I wrote a piece about this, but so I think it applies to, it doesn't matter, what color, what religion, you're supposed to pretend that such distinctions don't exist. And it happened also with the Halimi murder and other issues where everyone just tried to ignore the fact that the victim was Jewish and had been killed by an anti-Semite. You don't talk about those things.
We're running out of time, and I see 2 hands.
Yes, raise your hands
3.
very high. Yes.
Thank you. It's very telling that we were talking about race in France, and all assumed we're talking about le métropole French there, and we completely forgot all the l'outre-mer, and it's kind of in the French psyche also to have that, and although it's understood by a large number of people that race relationships in the island is very, very complicated in regards to the slavery and how white you are in different of that. A point I wanted to talk about is the often misunderstanding in countries outside of France on the history of laïcité and the 1905, the founding creation of that. There was at a time where France had still a lot of, in the countryside, people didn't speak French or very little of it, and it was a lot of different pieces, and the School of the Republic was created to kind of to level that out, so that all these basically white people that lived in the countryside would become the French nation, very centralized by that. And I feel that it was never thought for the populations from outside of France, from the colonies, and the idea of the French Republican school, where nos ancêtres les Gaulois, which worked on the métropole, doesn't work at all there, and the me schooled in the 70s and 80s, that was the functioning of it. It did not. And there's there's this joke going around when they were teaching that in Algeria to the little Muslim school children. It was ridiculous. But the understanding of the métropole view of that, I feel today, listening to you, really doesn't include the populations outside of continental France.
There was, I think, before you, there was, yes, in the third back row.
Yes. I had a question about laïcité or secularism also, and it seems to me, I know you all have slightly different points of view, but I'm wondering if there's a subtext that, wow, the Americans are kind of getting it a little righter than France, or whether the younger generation is saying the Americans are really taking on racism better. And it seems to me that you're suggesting that the secular model is somehow perpetuating racism more than our model, which obviously in the States you can be Jewish American, Irish American, anything you want, African American. And so I'm wondering whether I'm wondering whether you're suggesting that somehow the French model of laïcité leads to a more racist society than what we have in the United States.
I think the distinction was between like ethnicity and religion. And the sort of French aversion to having these hyphenated identities. You're French, you're not a Muslim French, you're not an American French, you're not a whatever French.
I mean, it's beyond an aversion. It's in our constitution, right? La francité est une et indivisible. L'identité Frenchness is one and indivisible. You cannot hyphenate it with, all the other. But so I really for 35 seconds answer to you, the gentleman, my poor German cousin over there. And I think it will replicate what you were saying about this view. Basically, Frenchness is la métropole, right, the hexagon, and also give like an entry point to the last question. So the issue with race, when I say I am black, when I see myself as black, I don't wake up every day with an anxiety of, oh my God, am I blacker than yesterday? Will I be as black tomorrow? Blackness, my color, is not at all like a huge part of my identity. It was made to be. It was made to be, right? It fueled the Western world, capitalism, France, the UK, were literally born from blackness. There was a moment where we had to rationalize taking human beings and making them work for free. And the way you rationalize that is by making them non-human. In our Code Noir, the slaves were furnitures, right? You had to rationalize it religiously. I mean, if you die and go in front of the pearly gates, you're not going to tell God, oh my God, I make your babies work for free. They are not your babies anymore. You had to rationalize it. So for all these reasons, blackness was created We created la race, right? It worked for 400 years, and then all of a sudden, hey, we did two things that were really bad, the Holocaust and the slavery. It was because of race. Let's take this word. Bra, it's taken care of. Well, I say this, and I often say this to my students. I don't want to live in a post-racial world, a world where race doesn't exist. I want to live in a post-racist world. And it's a world where we understood why race was created, what it did for 400 years, and what he's still doing. Nahel would have absolutely not died if he was white. And Nahel died, and it's in the continuity of the person who died 15 years before him, and the person who died 30 years before him, and the person who died in Guadeloupe, and the person who died in every single corner of the French Empire. His death is a continuity in a history that is being erased. And unless we don't understand what race does, we will not be able to go forward.
Yeah, just in answer to your question, hello, man. Yeah, hi. No, I would just like to state clearly that I do not think the United States is doing better than France. I do not. I think racism in the United States. Yes, the country's made some progress. Yes, we had a black president, but right now we have a huge white male reaction against the idea of a United States that's less white, which is at the core of the Donald J. Trump movement, which could retake the presidency next year. And I think the racial situation in the United States is extremely fraught. Day to day, I probably feel it, although you see much more intermingling, I would say, than you see in France. I would say the atmosphere, it's not as bad as, I'm talking about New York mainly now, it's not as bad as in the 80s, but I think it's more, you feel it as more fraught day to day, probably, than you do in France. So no, I reject the idea that the United States has lessons to give France on racism.
I think we're going to have a question from
our Zoom audience.
Many people
Yes.
on Zoom. How many people on Zoom?
How many? We have 40 people on Zoom right now. So thank you, all 40 people, for joining us. And interestingly enough, several people on Zoom have been asking about migration and immigration. And I think if I can synthesize some of the questions we have here, they'd like to know what the relationship between the question of immigration and the question of race are, and how that differs across the history of migration in France and in the US.
So it's a very
You
big
have
question.
2 minutes.
I can tell you that having been through immigration processes, both in the US and in France, it is quite striking in France how when you emigrate to France, there are certain really overwhelmingly important things. One is you have to speak French. And secondly, you have to know what laïcité is. It's become the absolute essential number one question you are asked when you go in for an immigration interview. So, I don't know, who on the panel would like to address this question of migration, immigration?
I can speak quickly about laïcité. So the thing is that in the French Constitution, the official language is set. So la langue de la République est le français. So the French, the language in France officially is French. It's not the case in the US, for example. So that really changes many things. And the other thing I wanted to answer to your question about laïcité, I don't think that the laïcité itself is a problem. It's the way it's been interpreted and changed. In 2004, it was changed. It's not the same laïcité as it used to be 120 years ago. So to me, it's a new tool to set a new way of seeing the French identity, but the laïcité as it was applied originally was not the same. And for example, recently the Conseil d'État allowed the FIFA, so the FFF, sorry, how do you say that? The French Federation of Football, to exclude athletes who would wear hijab. But the decision was not based on laïcité because it was not possible. It was based on the respect of public order. So that's and the same like the law that was voted 10 years ago to ban the full veil, which is not applicable anymore with the masks. But there is a law that don't allow you to be face covered in the streets. It was not based on laicity, because it's not possible to prevent someone from practicing their religion in the streets. So it was also based on public order. So it's also important to see how people mention laicity and how legally it's not tied to laicity but to public order. And even like recently the abaya ban, so it was based on laicity but on an extensive interpretation of what is religious or not.
Yeah, I just want to say two things about the question. The United States is a nation of immigrants. France is not. That is a fundamental difference.
The Romans were immigrants.
The black population of the United States largely exists through the massive importation of slavery into the United States. That is not the case in France. It's different. So I think those are two fundamental differences between the countries.
And I may add that if you are like, immigration is also connected to non-whiteness. If you are not white, even if you're French, you're seen as an immigrant or as being part of, an immigration process. And I think that also defines how you're seen and how you interfere with other white French people.
So the question of where are you from is forever asked. Right. Emily, I think we're out of time.
Can we have one more round of applause for our wonderful panelists today?